The security guard's hand was already on the old woman's arm, rough, impatient, steering her toward the exit, like she was something that needed to be removed rather than a person who needed to be heard. Her bag hit the marble floor. A prescription bottle rolled. Old photographs scattered across the polished stone in different directions. Dozens of people stood watching phones, raised, saying nothing. The man in the worn work jacket and scuffed boots had no reason to get involved. He was nobody in a place built for somebody else. But he stepped forward anyway, put himself between the guard and the woman, and said two words that made the entire floor go silent. Let her go. Ryan Walker had not planned to be here today. He had planned to sleep. That was the honest truth after 4 consecutive night shifts crawling through tight utility spaces and rewiring commercial HVAC units in buildings that never thanked him for the heat they kept. Sleep was the only thing on his mind when he finally punched out at 6 in the morning. But a broken water line near his apartment building had killed that plan before it started, and by 10 o'clock he found himself showered, restless, and driving without a clear destination, until Ashton Square appeared on his left, its glass facade catching the late morning sun like it was designed specifically to remind people like him that some spaces were not built for them. He pulled into the parking structure anyway. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he was tired of driving. Maybe because he hadn't eaten since midnight, and the food court was as good a reason as any to stop moving. He locked his truck on the 4th level, rode the elevator down to the main concourse, and stepped into the kind of air that only existed in places where everything cost too much. Cool, faintly scented, carefully controlled, as though even the atmosphere had been curated for a specific type of guest. The floors were polished marble that reflected the overhead lighting in long, pale sheets. Every storefront was designed to make you feel like you were already a little less than whatever was being sold inside, and the effect was not accidental. Ryan moved through the atrium with his hands in the pockets of his jacket. It was a decent jacket, insulated, durable, the kind built for work rather than appearance, but it had seen 3 winters of real use, and it looked like it. His boots were steel-toed and scuffed in the way that only comes from actually using them on job sites rather than sidewalks. He was not oblivious to the way a few people clocked him as he walked through that brief, assessing glance that lasted just long enough to file him under the wrong category and move on. He had lived 34 years in that category. He knew the look. He didn't slow down for it. He passed a cologne counter where a young man in a white jacket offered him a sample strip without making eye contact. He passed a handbag display where the cheapest item visible carried a price tag he couldn't read from the aisle, but could estimate from the lighting alone. He was heading toward the upper food court when he heard the voice, sharp, carrying engineered to cut through ambient noise without technically being a shout. It came from the entrance of a boutique near the East Corridor, a store whose name was rendered in brushed gold lettering above a door that probably cost more to install than Ryan made in 2 months. The voice belonged to a woman in a fitted blazer, the color of charcoal, her hair pulled back, in a way that communicated authority and very little patience. She was speaking to someone near the entrance, and the tone she was using was the kind reserved for problems that needed to be removed rather than resolved. Ryan slowed without deciding to. He looked toward the entrance of the boutique and saw the old woman for the first time. She was standing just inside the threshold, or trying to, with a canvas tote bag hanging from one arm, and both hands raised slightly, in a gesture that was somewhere between defense and apology. She was slight white-haired, dressed in a wool coat that had gone thin at the elbows, and carried the specific softness of something worn regularly over many years. Her shoes were sensible and old. She looked like someone's grandmother who had wandered into the wrong aisle, except the way she held herself quietly upright. Her chin level suggested she was not confused at all. She had simply made the mistake of existing in the wrong place. The woman in the blazer was Vanessa Reed, though Ryan didn't know her name yet. She was the floor manager of the boutique, and she was doing her job as she understood it, which was to maintain the visual standard of the space and remove anything that disrupted it. She was not yelling. That was the efficient cruelty of it. Her voice stayed even almost clinical, as she explained to the old woman that the store was a curated shopping environment, and that unfortunately, the boutique catered to a specific clientele. She used phrases like brand alignment and guest experience, with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the language of exclusion until it no longer felt like what it was. The old woman, Eleanor Hayes, though Ryan didn't know that name yet, either listened without interrupting. Eleanor said something Ryan couldn't fully hear from where he stood. Whatever it was, it didn't change anything. Vanessa gave a short nod to the security guard standing 2 feet away. Travis Miller, broad-shouldered, already shifting his weight forward, and Travis took Eleanor's arm above the elbow and began steering her toward the corridor. Not violently, not with any visible anger, just efficiently, the way you move furniture that's in the wrong position. Eleanor's tote bag swung wide with the motion, caught the edge of a low display table near the entrance, and fell. The bag hit the marble with a flat, hard sound. The contents came out fast: a folded pharmacy receipt, a small pill organizer, a leather wallet worn to softness at the corners, and 4 or 5 photographs, the kind printed on actual paper, that slid across the floor in different directions. One of them came to rest face up near Ryan's foot, and he looked down at it without thinking. It was a photograph of a building, not this building, but something older, smaller, the kind of structure that existed before glass facades and brushed gold lettering. A storefront maybe, or a small commercial space. Someone had written a date in pen along the white border at the bottom. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the handwriting was precise and deliberate, the kind of handwriting people used when they believed what they were writing down mattered and intended it to last. Ryan looked up. Eleanor was crouching slowly, carefully trying to gather her things from the floor, with a hand Travis wasn't holding. Her movements were unhurried, not because she wasn't bothered, but because she had clearly decided not to let it show in her body. Nobody moved to help her. The dozen or so people nearby had arranged themselves into the posture of the uninvolved, turned slightly away attention, directed at phones or display windows or the middle distance. A few were filming. One man in an expensive coat watched with an expression of mild distaste, as though the real disruption was not what Vanessa had done, but the mess Eleanor's bag had created on the otherwise immaculate floor. Something settled in Ryan's chest. Not anger, not yet. It was something quieter and heavier than anger, the feeling of recognizing something you have seen before and knowing exactly what it is. He had felt it in other rooms, in other years, in moments when the path of least resistance was simply to keep walking and let someone else be the problem that got handled. He had taken that path before, not because he was cowardly, but because he was tired, and tired people conserve what they have left. He remembered what it felt like afterward, that specific flatness that settled in when you chose the easier direction. It felt like nothing, which was the worst part, because nothing was exactly what it produced. He crossed the distance between himself and the boutique entrance in a few even strides. He reached down and picked up the photograph near his foot, then 2 more that had slid close to the doorframe. He gathered them carefully, the way you handle something that belongs to someone else and carries weight you can't fully measure. Travis noticed him first. The guard's grip on Eleanor's arm didn't release, but his attention shifted, tracking the new variable reassessing. Vanessa noticed him a second later. Her gaze moved over Ryan in the same way it had moved over Eleanor, quick, comprehensive, arriving at a conclusion before any real information had been exchanged. Ryan straightened up Eleanor's tote bag in one hand, the photographs in the other. He placed the photographs into the bag carefully and held it out to Eleanor. She took it with a steadiness that surprised him. Up close, her face was calm, not the calm of someone who wasn't affected, but the calm of someone who had decided well before this moment not to let her face become a place where other people's cruelty got to live. Ryan turned to Travis. He kept his voice level, the way you speak when you want to be heard clearly and not misunderstood as a threat. "Let her go." Travis didn't move. His expression shifted slightly, the look of a man who had been given an instruction by his manager and was now receiving interference from a stranger in a work jacket. Ryan held his position and didn't look away. "She didn't take anything. She didn't hurt anyone. Let her go." Vanessa stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice had lost none of its precision. "Sir, this is a private retail environment, and I'm going to have to ask you to—" Ryan turned to look at her directly, and something in the directness of it stopped her sentence before it finished. He wasn't loud, he wasn't aggressive, but he was not performing the polite social retreat that the situation had been designed to produce. And Vanessa Reed was a woman who had learned to rely on that retreat happening on schedule. "I'm not asking you," Ryan said. He looked back at Travis. "I'm asking him." The corridor had gotten quieter. Not silent. There was still the ambient music of the mall, the distant sound of foot traffic from other levels. But the immediate space had changed in the way that spaces change when something real is happening in them. A few of the people who had been looking elsewhere were now looking here. Someone lowered their phone. A woman near the adjacent storefront had stopped walking entirely and was watching with her shopping bag held motionless at her side. The geometry of the moment had shifted, and everyone within range of it could feel that shift, even those who hadn't yet decided what to do with what they were feeling. Travis released Eleanor's arm. He didn't frame it as a concession, his expression made that clear, but his hand came down, and Eleanor stepped back, pulling her coat straight with a composed, unhurried motion. She had a quality to her that Ryan noticed properly for the first time, now that she was standing free, a steadiness that had nothing to do with the coat's age or the shoes wear. She carried it the way people carry things they've had long enough that they no longer think about carrying them. Vanessa's voice came back clipped and pointed. "You need to understand that you are interfering with store operations, and I have every right to—" Ryan looked at her. "To what?" The question came out quiet and entirely sincere. "To have her removed for what? What did she do?" Vanessa's mouth tightened. She had an answer, she always had an answer. But the answers she had were the kind that worked in policy documents and became something else entirely when spoken aloud in front of people who were paying attention. From somewhere behind Ryan, a voice said low and flat, "Yeah, what did she do?" Ryan didn't turn around to find the source, but Vanessa heard it. Her eyes moved past him out toward the gathering edge of the corridor, and for the first time, something behind her composed expression worked against its own composure. Eleanor touched Ryan's arm once lightly. "Young man," she said, and her voice was quieter than he expected, measured dry, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being the most composed person in a difficult room. "You didn't have to do that." Ryan looked at her. Up close, her eyes were clear and dark and carried more history than anything else in the building. "I know," he said. She studied him for a moment, as though deciding whether she believed that, and then gave a single nod that closed the question without fanfare. Ryan picked up the last photograph from the floor, the one with the handwritten date along the border, and held it out to her. Eleanor took it, glanced at it briefly, and placed it in her bag, with the deliberate care of someone returning a document to its proper file. She didn't explain what it was. She didn't offer any context. She pulled the strap of her tote over her shoulder, turned away from the boutique entrance, and began walking down the corridor with the same unhurried straightness she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Ryan watched her take 3 steps before he became aware that Vanessa was still talking, that Travis had a radio in his hand, and that the small crowd in the corridor had grown considerably larger than he had realized, while his attention was elsewhere. He stood at the entrance of the boutique, the man in the work jacket, the scuffed boots, the wrong category for this particular room, and understood clearly that whatever had just ended, something else had already started. He hadn't fixed anything. He had simply refused to look away at the exact moment when looking away would have cost him nothing. Whether that refusal meant anything beyond this corridor remained entirely unclear. But Eleanor Hayes was walking under her own power, and the marble floor held the shape of a space that was no longer entirely sure of itself. That for now was something. Vanessa did not let it go. That was the first thing Ryan understood as he stood at the edge of the boutique entrance, with the crowd thickening steadily behind him. She had a problem. Now, not just Eleanor, just a disrupted store entrance, but a man who had refused to move when asked in front of witnesses in a corridor that was rapidly becoming an audience. People like Vanessa Reed did not absorb that kind of moment. They redirected it. She turned the full weight of her attention onto Ryan, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted, still controlled but carrying something underneath. That control, which was closer to contempt than professionalism. "I don't know what you think you just accomplished," she said, "but I need you to understand that you are not a customer of this store. You are not an employee of this property, and you have no standing here whatsoever." Ryan looked at her, without changing his expression. "I'm standing right here," he said. "That's enough standing for me." Someone in the crowd produced a short laugh, involuntary, quickly suppressed. Vanessa's jaw tightened. She looked Ryan over with the same deliberate thoroughness she had applied to Eleanor, except this time she let it show. The jacket. The boots. The hands that carried the particular roughness that comes from using them for actual work over actual years. "This is a luxury retail environment," she said, spacing the words with a precision that made them feel like a verdict being read into the record. "We have a standard of presentation here, and frankly," she gestured at him, a small economical motion that managed to dismiss everything from his collar to the floor, "you don't meet it." Ryan had heard variations of that sentence his entire adult life. Not always in those words. Sometimes it was the way a hostess looked at him before asking if he had a reservation, running her eyes over him in the half-second before her professional smile arrived. Sometimes it was the slight recalibration in a salesperson's posture, the moment they decided he wasn't worth the pitch and began looking past him. He had absorbed those moments for years because absorbing them was what you did when you had work to return to and no energy left for battles that didn't pay anything. But he was not at work right now. He had nowhere to be. And Eleanor Hayes was still standing 15 feet behind him, in the corridor, her tote bag on her arm, watching him with those clear, steady eyes. Two other managers had appeared, a man in a slim-cut suit, whose name tag read Douglas, who had materialized from somewhere inside the boutique, and a woman in a silk blouse named Patricia, who came from the adjacent storefront with the practiced calm of someone experienced in public-facing incidents. They positioned themselves flanking Vanessa in a way that was not quite a wall, but was clearly intended to suggest one. Douglas spoke briefly into a radio, his voice too low to make out. Travis Miller had repositioned to Ryan's left, close enough to register as a presence, not close enough to constitute a provocation. "Not yet. You can leave on your own," Vanessa said, structuring the phrase as a courtesy while delivering it as a warning, "or we can have security escort you out. Either way, this conversation is finished." Ryan looked past her for a moment at the interior of the boutique, at the clothes arranged on minimalist racks, under carefully positioned lighting, at the environment she was so committed to protecting from the wrong kind of people, and then he looked back at her. "Is it?" he said. "Because I have a few questions, and I don't think you've answered any of them." He turned slightly, not performing to the crowd, but not pretending it wasn't there either. The corridor had filled to the point where people were stopping behind the first ring of watchers and rising on their toes to see over shoulders. He spoke at a volume that was comfortable and clear, the voice of a man used to explaining technical problems to building managers who needed to understand them quickly and completely. Did she steal something? The question was directed at Vanessa, but landed in the open air of the corridor. Vanessa said nothing. Did she threaten anyone? Still nothing. Did she damage property? Say something inappropriate to another customer? 'Cause any problem at all beyond walking through that door in a coat? You didn't like the look of. Each question came at the same even pace, without heat, without theater. Because I've been standing here for several minutes now, and I genuinely cannot figure out what she actually did wrong. Vanessa straightened her posture by a fraction. The store has the right to refuse. Ryan nodded once. I know the store has the right to refuse service. I'm asking what she did that made you decide to use it. The distinction was small, and it was everything. Vanessa opened her mouth and then closed it, and in the space of that half-second, Douglas cut in smoothly. This establishment maintained certain standards of— Ryan looked directly at Douglas. Standards of what? Douglas's prepared sentence didn't have a second half that worked in front of an audience of 40 people and a growing number of phone cameras, and he seemed to arrive at that realization while still in the middle of delivering it, because the sentence simply stopped without completing itself. Ryan turned back to face the corridor fully. He was not a man who made speeches. He had no appetite for performance and no training in it. But there were things he understood with a clarity that made silence feel dishonest, and this was one of them. "The problem isn't her appearance," he said. The words came out flat and certain, the way a measurement comes out when you've verified it twice and have no reason to doubt the result. "The problem is that everyone in this building, including everyone standing here right now, operates on the assumption that money decides who deserves to be treated with basic decency. And that's not a store policy. That's not a brand standard. That's just something you decided was normal a long time ago and stopped questioning, because questioning it would have been inconvenient." The corridor had gone quiet in the way that large shared spaces go quiet when everyone present is paying attention to the same thing. The mall's ambient music continued from the overhead speakers, something soft and instrumental chosen specifically to suggest a certain kind of refined ease, but the human noise had dropped to almost nothing. A woman near the far edge of the gathering crowd had one hand over her mouth. An older man in a golf shirt was watching Ryan with an expression that sat somewhere between discomfort and recognition. The look of someone hearing something said plainly that they had previously only thought in private. One of the boutique's junior employees, a young woman who had been standing just inside the doorway since the confrontation began, had taken a half-step backward, putting additional distance between herself and Vanessa, without making a production of it. Eleanor's voice came from behind Ryan, quiet and deliberate. "Young man, you've made your point. There's no need to—" Ryan turned to look at her. She was still composed, her tote bag settled on her arm, her coat straight, but her eyes held something that might have been concern directed not inward, but outward toward him. She had seen how situations like this resolved themselves, her expression suggested. She had a longer view of it than he did. Ryan held her gaze for a moment, acknowledged what he saw in it, and looked back at Vanessa. He wasn't done. Vanessa had recovered enough to make a decision. She gave Travis a short, definitive nod, and Travis moved toward Ryan with the professional ease of someone who had performed this particular task many times and expected it to resolve the same way it always had. "Sir," Travis said, "I'm going to need you to—" Ryan didn't move. His hand stayed in front of him, open, visible, his posture carrying nothing aggressive. He simply did not step back. And that refusal, quiet, physical, unambiguous cost Travis the smooth version of the next 30 seconds. "You can call the police," Ryan set, his eyes on Vanessa. "That's a legitimate option available to you. Call them, explain that a man in a work jacket refused to leave a public mall corridor while asking what an elderly woman did wrong, and see how that goes." He let the sentence sit where it landed. "Or you can answer the question." Vanessa's composure remained intact, but was working considerably harder than it had been at the start of this. Patricia touched Vanessa's arm briefly and said something close to her ear. Vanessa's expression shifted by a degree, not softening, but recalculating the available moves. Douglas had his phone out and was speaking into it in the low, formal register of someone contacting a level above his own authority. Ryan registered this without alarm. Whatever was coming next, he had already decided, before he first crossed the corridor toward Eleanor, that he was not going to perform the retreat that the room had been designed to produce. He had made that decision, and he had not revised it, and nothing in the intervening minutes had given him a reason to. Eleanor moved. She walked forward until she was standing beside Ryan, not announcing the action, not making a gesture of it, simply repositioning until she was there. At his left, a small, white-haired woman in a worn wool coat, standing at the entrance to a corridor full of people watching them both. "I appreciate what you're doing," she said to him, low enough that it wasn't addressed to the crowd. "But I've been managing difficult rooms for longer than you've been alive." Ryan looked at her. There was something dry and weighted in the way she said it. Not dismissive, but carrying more information than the surface of the sentence contained. "I believe you," he said. "But I'm not leaving." She studied him with those clear, dark eyes for a moment longer than felt comfortable. And then, something in her expression adjusted, not softening exactly, but making room, the way a person makes room when they encounter something unexpected, and decide after consideration to let it stand. The shift in the crowd happened before Ryan identified its cause. The ring of observers, which had held its position throughout, suddenly parted, opening a lane through the center of the atrium, the way crowds instinctively clear space for someone moving with clear purpose. Ryan tracked the motion back to its source and found a woman crossing the atrium floor from the direction of the management offices at the far end of the building. She was walking at a pace that wasn't quite a run, but covered ground, with the efficiency of someone who had somewhere specific to be and understood the cost of every second between here and there. She was young, late 20s, possibly early 30s, in a tailored dark jacket that had been chosen for function rather than display. Her hair was pulled back simply. She had the particular quality of someone who ran things and was still in the process of deciding what kind of person that responsibility was going to make her, not yet settled into it, not yet hardened by it. Her gaze was fixed on the boutique entrance as she crossed the atrium, and Ryan watched her eyes move from the entrance to the crowd, to Vanessa, to Eleanor. And when they reached Eleanor, something happened to her face that cut straight through whatever composed surface she maintained in the ordinary course of her days. It was immediate and unguarded and entirely human, and it lasted only a second before she controlled it. But Ryan caught it clearly. She covered the last 20 feet quickly and stopped in front of Eleanor. She looked down, noticed a small folded handkerchief near Eleanor's feet. It had slipped from the tote bag at some point during the confrontation, without either of them noticing, and crouched to pick it up. She held it out to Eleanor, with a hand that was not entirely steady. When she spoke, her voice came out barely above a murmur, stripped of every professional register, carrying only what it actually meant. "Grandma." The word entered the silence of the corridor and did not dissipate. Vanessa Reed went completely still. Travis Miller's radio produced a small burst of static, and he reached down and switched it off. Douglas lowered his phone from his ear. Patricia's hand, which had been in the process of rising toward Vanessa's arm again, stopped at mid-motion and did not complete it. The junior employee inside the boutique doorway pressed both palms flat against the wall behind her. The crowd, which had grown to 40 or 50 people, possibly more, made no sound at all. Ryan looked at the woman who had spoken. Then he looked at Eleanor. Eleanor took the handkerchief from the young woman's hand and placed it in her coat pocket with the unhurried precision of someone who had been waiting with complete patience for a particular moment to arrive on its own schedule. "Claire," she said simply, with no particular emphasis, the way you greet someone who has just walked into a room you have been sitting in for some time. Claire Hayes, CEO of Ashton Square, stood in the corridor she owned in front of the boutique she oversaw and looked at the woman her security guard had grabbed by the arm and steered toward the exit like an object that needed relocating. The air in the corridor had acquired the texture of a room in which something irreversible has just become impossible to look away from. Every person present understood at the same moment that the story they had been watching was not the story they had actually been standing in. And no, not Vanessa, not Douglas, not Patricia, not Travis Miller with his switched-off radio had any prepared sentence for what was going to happen next. Claire Hayes did not move immediately. She stood in the corridor, with her hand still slightly extended from handing Eleanor the handkerchief, and she took in the space around her with the specific attention of someone assessing the full scope of damage rather than just the point of impact. Her eyes moved from Eleanor to Travis, from Travis to Vanessa, from Vanessa to the crowd, and the phones and the faces arranged in a wide, silent ring, and then to the security monitor mounted above the boutique entrance, its small screen cycling through camera feeds from across the property. She looked at that screen for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then she looked at Douglas. Pull the footage, she said. Her voice carried no drama and required no elevation to be heard in the quiet corridor. Douglas already had his phone in his hand. He looked at it, then at Vanessa, then back at Claire, and the order of those glances told Ryan everything he needed to know about the internal geometry of what was coming. All of it, Claire added. East corridor entrance. The last 40 minutes. Douglas nodded and stepped away without a word. Vanessa watched him go, and the composure she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation with Ryan, that smooth, professional surface, developed its first visible crack. What followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no footage projected onto a screen, no orchestrated moment of public revelation. A property manager brought a tablet from the security office, and Claire reviewed the recording herself, standing in the corridor with Eleanor beside her. The crowd maintained its distance. Ryan stayed where he was, off to one side, close enough to observe Claire's face, without being able to see the screen. He didn't need to see it. He could read what was on it in the movement of her expression, the way her eyes tightened when the camera captured Vanessa's interaction with Eleanor, the specific quality of stillness that came over her face, when Travis's handling of the old woman became visible in the frame. It was the stillness of someone absorbing something they cannot immediately process into language. Claire handed the tablet back without speaking. She stood for a moment with her attention on the floor in front of her, and then raised her head and looked directly at Vanessa Reed. "You've been with this property for 6 years," she said. The observation arrived without inflection, as though she were confirming a figure from a balance sheet. Vanessa straightened. "Ms. Hayes, if I could give you some context." Claire shook her head once, a small final motion that left no opening. "I watched the footage. There's no context that changes what I saw." Vanessa's mouth closed. What Claire said next, she said without apparent satisfaction, which made it land with considerably more weight than if she had seemed to want it. "You're terminated effective immediately. Douglas will handle the separation process. Please leave the floor." Vanessa held her position for a moment that ran several seconds longer than it should have, long enough that the entire corridor felt it. And then she turned and walked toward the management corridor without another word. Her posture remained intact. Her direction had changed permanently. The junior employee inside the boutique doorway released a breath that was audible in the surrounding quiet. Claire turned to Travis Miller. Travis had not moved from his position since the moment he released Eleanor's arm, and he had the look of a man who had understood somewhere in the last several minutes that the ground beneath him had shifted significantly, and he had not yet located a stable place to stand. "You're suspended pending a full internal review," Claire said. "Don't leave the property before you've spoken with HR." Travis gave a single nod, his jaw set, and stepped back. Claire's gaze moved to Patricia, then to the other managers who had gathered in the corridor at various points during the confrontation. She said nothing to them directly. She didn't need to. The look she gave them communicated with precision that she was aware of their presence throughout the incident, aware of their silence, and intended to address both in a different setting at a different time. The crowd had not thinned. If anything, it had grown. As the resolution became visible, people who had arrived late had stayed when they understood the ending was still arriving, and now they watched it complete itself in the quiet of the East Corridor. Ryan stood among them without having made a decision to remain. He was aware that he was still occupying space in a building he had entered by accident less than an hour ago, still wearing the jacket and the boots that had made him a secondary target, still without a clear reason to be standing here, except that leaving continued to feel wrong in a way he hadn't fully worked out. Claire crossed to where Ryan stood. She did it directly, without ceremony or preamble. She stopped in front of him and looked at him with the same clear, functional attention she had directed at everything since arriving in the corridor. "I watched what you did," she said. "I watched all of it." Ryan met her gaze and waited. You didn't know who she was, Claire said. It was not a question. No, Ryan said. I didn't. Claire nodded slowly, not with surprise, but with the quality of someone confirming something they had needed confirmed. There were 40-some people in this corridor, she said. Every one of them had a phone out. You were the only one who walked over. Ryan didn't respond to that. He didn't have a response that wasn't mostly just noise filling space, and he had a low tolerance for that kind of noise. Claire seemed to read this accurately, because she didn't wait for him to fill the silence. Thank you, she said. The simplicity of it was its own precision, no elaboration, no performance, just the two words placed exactly where they were supposed to go. Ryan gave a short nod. She shouldn't have needed someone to step in, he said. That's the part worth thinking about. Claire held his gaze steadily. I know, she said. I am. Eleanor had positioned herself slightly apart from the exchange, the way people stand when a conversation concerns them, but doesn't require their active participation. Her tote bag was on her arm, her coat straight her attention on Claire, and the expression on her face was one Ryan had not seen there before. Not pride exactly. Something more tempered than pride, something that had considerably more history behind it. When Claire stepped back toward her, Eleanor reached up and touched her granddaughter's face once with the back of her hand, a brief unhurried gesture that communicated more than the corridor had room to contain. You didn't have to come down yourself, Eleanor said. Claire looked at her without wavering. Yes, I did, she said. Eleanor considered this for a moment, and then gave the same single nod she had given Ryan in the early minutes of the confrontation, the nod of someone choosing to accept, rather than contest. In the days that followed, Ryan learned what none of the people in the corridor had known while they were standing in it. Eleanor Hayes had founded Ashton Square more than 40 years earlier, at a time when the lot it now occupied had been a failing industrial block on the edge of a neighborhood that nobody with serious money was paying attention to. She had started with a single retail lease she had negotiated herself, and over the following 2 decades, she had built the property into what it eventually became the most recognized luxury shopping destination in the city, a building that had outlasted several economic cycles and carried her name in its founding documents, though nowhere on its walls. When she transferred operational control to Claire 3 years before the incident in the corridor, she did it without announcement and without fanfare, and she continued visiting the property the same way she always had, unannounced, unescorted, wearing the same kind of coat she had always worn, carrying the same kind of bag. Not to inspect, not to evaluate, but because it was hers in the way that something you build from a failing industrial block remains yours, regardless of whose name appears on the current operating agreement. The photographs that had scattered across the marble floor, including the one Ryan had picked up near his foot, the one with the handwritten date faded to pale brown along the white border, were photographs of the original building. The structure that had existed on that lot before the glass facade, and the brushed gold lettering, and the polished marble that reflected everything back at twice its cost. Eleanor had carried them in her tote bag for years. She had not brought them to show anyone. She brought them the way people carry certain things, because putting them down had never felt like the right decision. The security footage from the East Corridor was not made public. Claire made that decision herself, and explained it directly. The people who needed to see it had seen it, and releasing it as viewable content served the spectacle more than it served Eleanor or anyone else. What she did release 3 days after the incident was a written statement from Ashton Square. It was notable for what it did not contain. No passive constructions designed to acknowledge wrongdoing while distributing the responsibility into abstraction, no corporate language engineered to sound like accountability, while committing to nothing specific. It said plainly that a member of the property's management staff had treated a visitor with deliberate cruelty, that other staff members had witnessed the treatment and failed to intervene, and that this reflected a culture within the property that the ownership intended to change, beginning with the people responsible for shaping and maintaining it. The statement mentioned Ryan by name. It described what he had done with the same directness that characterized the rest of it, that a visitor to the property had intervened on behalf of another visitor when no one else did, and that the property owed him an explicit public acknowledgement of that fact. Ryan read the statement on his phone on a Tuesday morning before a shift, sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the building he was scheduled to work on that day. He read it twice. He wasn't sure how he felt about being named. He had not stepped forward in that corridor in order to end up in a statement. But he understood that Claire Hayes had a reason for including him, and the reason she had was not primarily about him. The call from Claire came the following week. She was direct on the phone in exactly the same way she had been direct in the corridor, which Ryan found straightforward to work with. She explained that Ashton Square was undertaking a comprehensive review of its customer service culture, not as a public relations response to the incident. She said, with a flatness that acknowledged the way those words sounded and wanted to get ahead of the skepticism, but as a structural process, beginning with the assumptions built into how staff were trained to read a room and decide who belonged in it. She asked whether Ryan would be willing to serve as a consultant on the program's development. She explained clearly what the role would involve, what the time commitment looked like, and what it would pay. She did not oversell any of it. Ryan asked her one question before he said anything else. Is this about repairing the reputation or repairing the problem? There was a moment of quiet on Claire's end of the line, not evasive, but the quality of quiet that precedes an honest answer rather than a prepared one. Then she said, "That's exactly why I'm calling you instead of a communications firm." Ryan sat with that for 2 days. He called back on a Thursday afternoon and said yes, not because of the compensation, though it was reasonable, and not because of what the role represented in terms of his own circumstances changing. He said yes because the answer to his question had been the right answer, delivered without decoration, and because he had stood in that corridor and watched more than 40 people do nothing, and he did not want the only lasting product of that morning to be a news cycle that peaked and faded and left everything underneath it exactly where it had been. The program took 4 months to build, and another 2 to implement across the property. Ryan worked on it in the margins of his regular schedule, early mornings, late evenings, the hours that existed around the shifts, rather than instead of them. He was not a consultant by training, and he said so directly every time the word came up in a meeting. What he was someone who had spent the better part of his adult life being assessed by appearance in spaces that had not been built with him in mind, and who understood from the inside, not from a study or a framework, but from the accumulated experience of 34 years of those assessing glances, what that evaluation felt like on the receiving end, and what it cost the people who absorbed it daily. That understanding, it turned out, was more useful to the program than any credential would have been. On the morning the new program formally launched across the property, Eleanor Hayes came back to Ashton Square. She arrived the same way she always had. No advance notice, no escort, no call placed to let anyone know she was coming. She wore the same wool coat, the same sensible shoes. She carried the same canvas tote bag on her arm and moved through the atrium with the same composed, unhurried straightness she had carried out of the boutique entrance on the day of the incident. But as she turned into the east corridor, the same marble floor, the same brushed gold lettering above the same boutique door. Something was different in the space around her. The staff member at the nearest store entrance looked up as she approached, recognized her, not because a memo had been distributed that morning, but because the new training materials included photographs and background and the clear explanation that this woman had built the structure they were currently standing inside, and said good morning with the uncomplicated directness of someone who meant it without calculation. Eleanor nodded, said good morning in return, kept walking. Further along the corridor, another employee looked up and did the same, and another. Not a formal greeting line, not a staged moment. Just acknowledgement extended plainly without theater, the way it should have been extended from the beginning. Ryan was not there to see it. He had a shift that morning, a commercial refrigeration unit in a restaurant kitchen that had been running 3 degrees warm since the previous night and needed a diagnosis before the lunch service. He was lying under a steel prep counter with a diagnostic kit and a flashlight working through the likely causes in the order of probability when Eleanor Hayes walked back into Ashton Square for the first time since the morning the security guard had her by the arm. He didn't know what time she arrived. He didn't know how long she stayed, or which parts of the building she walked through, or whether she went back to the boutique entrance and stood there for a moment, the way people sometimes return to the places where something important happened to them. He learned about it later that afternoon from a text message Claire sent him while he was packing his tools back into his truck. It said only, "She came back today. Everyone got it right." Ryan read it, put his phone back into his chest pocket, and drove to the next job. Nobody looked at his boots. Nobody needed to anymore. And if that seemed like a small outcome to have spent a morning fighting for in a building he had entered by accident, in a corridor he had no reason to be standing in, on a day he had originally planned to spend, sleeping Ryan Walker had long since decided it was not a small thing at all. He had decided that in the moment he crossed the distance between himself and a stranger crouching on a marble floor, trying to gather her photographs with the hand that wasn't being held, and nothing that had happened in the time since had given him any reason to reconsider.